They are made to believe immigrants and asylum seekers are the root of all their problems because the mainstream media tells them that they are. Speaking of that, Helza, speaking of that particular framework, I actually had something in my watch later that specifically relates to that, which is John Redwood on Talk TV claiming that uncontrolled migration is causing the cost of living crisis in the UK. Because, of course, it's not Shell, it can't be BP, it can't be Centrica, or all the people with the causing the energy crisis that was the root cause of the inflationary crisis that we've seen, or indeed Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. No, it's all of the Browns coming over. Those are the people causing the cost of living crisis. So let's analyse John Redwood's arguments as to why it's not massive conglomerations of corporations and energy suppliers, and is indeed a few thousand brown people.
Now, these statistics that Rishi has triumphantly released today reveal that fast-tracking migrants through the asylum-seeking system is obviously going on as we speak. But the upshot of it is that 67% of people who have basically arrived here illegally and then claimed political asylum have been given that. So they've been allowed to stay. Where is the deterrent in that? So are you saying to buy...
I mean, there's not supposed to be a deterrent by having a functioning asylum system. If you arrive to claim asylum, you have to arrive illegally. That is how the asylum system works. And then either your claim is accepted because it's real, or it's rejected because it's not. Or you just get lost like all those children that got lost that we forgot about. But there's no deterrent in having a functioning asylum system. The Rwanda Scheme was supposed to be the deterrent. The fact that you might drown in the Channel, that's a deterrent. Having a functioning asylum, unless you want to just completely remove yourself from the Refugee Convention, that doesn't make any sense. Also, thank you for the 5 gifted young black economists. Thank you very much, as always, for the continued support.
Migrants, when you come across the Channel, 67% chance of staying. Nowhere else in the world do you get those kind of odds. Where is the deterrent?
I think you're right to ask that question. I think it's a great pity that I'm in my constituency working today and not allowed to be in Parliament to cross-examine the Home Secretary, because we really needed a statement on something of this importance. It is good news the civil service are now processing more people, as they call it. It's bad news that there are still a lot coming, so that the backlog builds up again. And it's certainly questionable as to why such a high proportion are being granted status they seek when there are safe routes and safe ways of applying which they decided not to use for themselves.
There aren't safe routes for applying. The Home Secretary, or at least the Home Secretary at the time, Suella Braverman, was in a select committee meeting being asked questions by her own party's MPs on how one might apply for asylum if they were coming from a country that wasn't Ukraine, Hong Kong, Afghanistan or Syria, and she couldn't answer the question. There is no safe and legal route for someone applying from Eritrea or someone applying here from Somalia or from Sudan, right? Like, those do not have safe and legal routes. The whole time we've been talking about is wanting safe and legal routes. Why do we need a deterrent? If you process people properly, then those without a valid claim can be turned away. Well, that's the issue. That's the issue that we have. Yeah, of course, John Redwood wants to privatise the NHS. He wants to privatise everything. He's like a proper, almost an anarcho-capitalist, like a minarchist.
And these things the government must answer when we get back to Parliament next week.
Is the problem here, Sir John, that there now exists in the canon of law and case precedent, if you will, such low thresholds to claiming asylum here in the UK that of the 25,000 who have been told they've got to go home, it'll probably be back 25,000 appeals, many of which then end up staying. And that the threshold to come into the country and say that you're not safe where you live, that the medical care is not appropriate, that it's impoverished, that it persecutes homosexuals, that there's civil unrest, that you've got a pretty unpleasant, tyrannical president, which basically...
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. All legitimate reasons that someone might want to claim asylum. It's incredible listening to Conservatives talk. It's like you can't even hear them. They can't even hear themselves, which is out here saying, oh, these people are under tyrannical governments. These people might be persecuted for being homosexual. These people might be in the midst of a civil war, like in Syria. Or crazy people might want to come here and claim asylum.
Basically covers still a fair chunk of the world, just gives you access to come here. And that it's now got to the point that, you know, we need to somehow raise those thresholds.
Here's an idea. How about don't intervene and destabilise huge swathes of the world? It might help you issues there. Oh, people are coming here from Iran. Well, shouldn't have cooed Mossadegh, should you?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Yes, I think we need to discuss that. What I'm interested in, and I think many voters are interested in, is having much better overall controls on the number of people who come to this country legally, whether they come in their main numbers by applying properly and getting legal status granted, or they come in this illegal way and then get it converted into legal status. Because, of course, there are far, far bigger numbers coming legally than there are people being granted it after one of these dangerous small boat journeys, joining in a criminal conspiracy in order to get here. So I think the government needs to do an awful lot more to control total migration, because as I've been pointing out, and as you're implying in some of the things you're saying, it is very difficult to accept hundreds of thousands of extra people every year because they need homes, they need school places,
That's how capitalist economies work. The population increases to get economic growth, and then you build the infrastructure to accommodate them with the new tax revenue you get from the increased population. You're an economist, John. I know that you know this is true, but you want to make an argument that's against what you believe, specifically to ensure that you can get people to dislike the outgroup that you want them to dislike. I know he knows this. I know he knows that the productive capacity of the economy is where we get our tax revenues from. So having an increase in population is what you need to grow the economy. And conservatives know this too, because they keep banging on, and correctly I might add, about our below replacement birth rates and our demographic collapse. They're correct to point this stuff out, but it is a completely untenable position for them to say, we can't deal with an increase in population from migration, but we also need an increase in population in terms of people having babies here, even though babies coming here, being born here rather, are a bigger burden on the state than new migrants, because you have to put them through 18 years of youth before they become a productive member of society. Whereas migrants come here and they start being productive potentially from day one if they get actual leave to remain and actually enter the workforce, which the vast majority of them do because you can't get benefits if you just come here. So this makes no sense. It's a completely untenable position to have. And I think it's reasonable to say both of these things are fine. I am completely ambivalent as to whether you want to incentivize people to have more births or whether you want to have migrants come in. We have a labour shortage in loads of sectors of the economy, and I think a really easy way of being able to fix that is having some migrants come in to be able to fulfil those roles. I'm completely ambivalent on this solution, but it is completely incoherent to say you want to have more births, but you also want to reduce migration because we can't deal with the people coming in. Because again, John knows this. He knows that an increase in population is necessary for a growing economy. We both want a growing economy, but he will then completely disregard one very easy way of having a growing economy because the people who might grow that economy are the wrong skin colour.
They need utilities, they need cities around them. And if you're going to invite in 750,000, as we did in the previous year, you need to build 3 Southamptons in that year to make sure they've got proper facilities. And we're simply not.
We're simply not building those things, right? Okay, so the problem that you have is that maybe we're not building enough infrastructure. Yeah, I agree. We're not building enough houses. We're not building enough schools. We're not building the 40 hospitals that your government promised that they would build, right? All of these things that we should be having more of, we're not filling. We're not doing. We're not investing in the infrastructure. I agree with that point completely, because that's what we would get to have a growing economy. Right? This is where I would agree with someone like Tom Harwood on this, where he says, why aren't we just building things? And I think he's 100% right to make that criticism very specifically, because that's how you get an economic growth that increases prosperity for everybody. But you're not going to get that by walling things off and building nothing, which might be apparently his solution to this, of course. I mean, I made this point earlier about, well, does he believe we need higher birth rates? I don't know specifically whether he believes that or not, but I know a lot of conservatives do, and I wanted to head that point off. But if he doesn't then also want to increase population somewhere else, is he going to be happy with being in a permanent recession because of demographic collapse? It's up to him, really and truly, whether he wants to see that happen.
Not able to keep up with that kind of rate of increase.
I think 1 Southampton is quite enough for all of us, with apologies to people from Southampton, of course.
Also worth pointing out as well that the biggest section of that 700,000, which is, to be fair, is a large figure, the largest amount of those 700,000 net migrants who are coming here was students, for the biggest number. Students and the people who are coming with them as families. Well, whilst of course they will need extra infrastructure, I'm not saying that it doesn't, we do need to invest more. But if they're coming over here to study, they're bringing foreign capital from other countries to here to spend on our universities, which is essentially an export, right? That's essentially an export good if it's using the productive capacity we have of our economy to bring in revenue from overseas. That's increasing the amount of money we have in the country, and that's being spent on our goods and services. It's essentially an export, which is going to be something that, again, increases the capital and the prosperity for everybody, because they'll still pay taxes on the things that they spend that money on. The family, unless they get a job, in which case they're being productive and increasing productive capacity of the economy, if they're rich people coming here to study, which they almost certainly are if they can afford to pay our university fees and move halfway across the world, the families of the people who are studying are also probably the same people who are using that foreign capital to then spend on our products, which essentially makes it even more of an export good, right? It's effectively an export good at that point, which therefore means more revenue for taxable income, which means more VAT, and what's this being spent on, which can then get spent on increasing the capacity of the infrastructure needed to sustain them. The people who are actually a drain on society are the people who are stuck in an asylum queue because we don't fund the asylum processing system to make them full citizens so they can get a job and work. That's the real people who are a drain on the system, the ones who are sitting there waiting for their asylum claims to be processed.
But to politicians, to John, of all creeds, are wont to tell us, the immigration, okay, it's an issue, but the real thing that matters is cost of living, people struggling to get by. I agree with that, but I also think politicians have a tendency to downgrade the importance of the migrant crisis, both legal and illegally, in electoral terms. I think it's going to be a big issue. Would you agree?
Well, I do agree, and I think it is part of the general economic problem that we're talking about. Because if you need to provide all this extra accommodation and all these extra facilities for people, many of them come in and either are not working at the beginning or they take very low-paid jobs in order to get in. And so there is a massive cost on taxpayers. An awful lot of the housing has...
Now, there was another MP that posted this shit, and I had to respond on Twitter. So I'm going to respond again to both of them. I think it was Neil O'Brien, I think the name of the MP was, essentially saying, well, migrants who come in generally work lower paid jobs, right, than people who are part of the native population. And that is true. That is a true fact that they do earn less and therefore pay less income tax. But the amount of tax that somebody pays is not only their income tax, it is also tax that they pay on other goods and services they buy, but it's also on the additional productive capacity of the economy that they create. So when you work for a company, do you think that the only increase in prosperity that you apply is what you get paid by that company? Of course it isn't, right? You work, you create products. Those products then go to market. They then get sold. The corporation gets taxed in terms of the corporate profits they create from the additional productive capacity they've added to the economy. It's, again, and this is nonsense economics that I know John Redwood understands this. I know he understands that where some of the additional taxable income could come from is where the products that you create from the additional capacity that you add to the economy, where it gets sold later on in the market. And I know that he knows this because the right always bang on about how businesses bring prosperity to the country. They always bang on about them being job creators and being the way in which that we unleash the wealth creation potential in this country by having a thriving business sector, which of course does need people to work in. So I'm making explicitly capitalist arguments here. I'm not making socialist arguments. I'm making capitalist ones here. The kind of ones that I know that John Redwood understands, except he's just either lying or deliberately misconstruing this to try and make us hate the outgroup. Because that's how our whole tax base works. Of course, the majority of it is PAYE. But the whole productive capacity of the economy is what is important.
To be subsidised. An awful lot of the public services need to provide extra surgeries, extra school places, and that is all extra taxation on the rest of us. And so those of us who want a low-tax, more prosperous Britain also want to control legal as well as illegal migration, because the public sector costs are just enormous if we carry on at this current very high level.
There's also a conversation.
If they're working, they're making income. Again, he keeps making this conflation with the idea that because someone needs a low earner, it means they're therefore a burden on the state, when that's not how macroeconomics works. And again, I know that he knows that that's not how that works. It's so frustrating to hear these nonsense arguments that make sense prima facie but aren't true in reality being made by somebody who I know knows better. Because the issue is, of course, I don't think he believes in public services. He just doesn't want there to be any public investment whatsoever. He'd rather the private sector did it. You'd think that all this extra demand that's coming from new people coming would therefore stimulate the private sector to increase supply. But I guess that's more of a kind of Keynesian argument, really and truly. But of course, our supply is constrained because NIMBYs, who run the Conservative Party, won't let us build anything. They've created this mess themselves.
Building at last that hasn't been touched for a very long time, still very delicate to touch now, which is that when people frame the problem of very high levels of migration as an economic one, that's only one part of the story. There also are cultural issues when you have lots of people coming from all around the world. I think the gross figure is over 1 million. So when you take out those who have gone back, you're talking about a very significant number of people who don't necessarily share our particular cultural mores or then end up coexisting within society as part of our social fabric.
She's right that there is a difference between the economic reasons people have for disliking migration and the social reasons have people disliking migration. But of course, as we've already gone through here, the economic reasons why people hate migration are wrong. They're nonsense, right? In fact, they've not even hit on like the actual real issue that you have economically from migration, which is that in certain sectors it can increase the supply of labour and therefore drive down wages. Of course, the way to solve this is by having collective bargaining agreements, but Conservatives don't want those things either. But the social ones are the ones that are also completely bunkum, because when you actually look at the ways in which integration happens, of course, I think you need to manage these things. I think there are certain steps you can take to make integration easier. But the studies that we've shown is that, especially when migrants are coming into city areas where there's a lot of people who are part of the initial population, maybe the first generation find it harder to integrate, but second generation immigrants almost always integrate pretty well. And the longer time they spend around people from the native population, the more integrated they become. And in fact, the less hateful of immigrants the native population become as well. It's ironic, really and truly, that the most pro-immigrant areas of the countries are the areas with the highest levels of immigration, places like London, cities like Birmingham and Manchester, and the places that are really anti-migration are all the white places like rural Norfolk.
Well, I mean, you're making your own point. I'm concentrating on the practical issues, because I think if you invite people into your country, they have expectations to live to a similar living standard to those who are already here. And we simply cannot deliver that expectation. And yes, the pace of change can be too great for the settled communities that they wish to join. And so there are tensions and issues which I would rather avoid by having a level of legal migration and controlled illegal migration that is much more easily assimilable.
To go back to deterrence, Sir John, James Cleverly,
It's funny because the Tories have more in common culturally than the Labour Party. They're homophobes and racists and deontological, and that's true, right? It is true, really and truly, that a lot of the cultural values between fundamentalist religious types are incredibly well shared, and people who are in the Conservative Party are far more likely to be Christian fundamentalists than the broader strokes of the population, and they share a lot of values with the people who they think are culturally unable to assimilate, who are mostly from Muslim countries. And again, as I said, when you look at younger generations of these people, they tend to be more culturally assimilated. How many kind of pro-trans young Muslims do you know? Like, there's quite a lot of them. Like, a lot of young Muslims are very politically active and very progressive. Maybe that's just the kind of circles that I go in, but for every single incredibly culturally conservative and reactionary first-generation older immigrant that there is, that has, probably does have, admittedly, pretty different cultural values from what people in the UK believe in. Their children do not share the values that they share. I mean, the amount of people, how many people do you know? Again, all anecdotal, please take this pinch of salt. But how many people do you know that you've grown up with as millennials, right, who are from Muslim backgrounds, who constantly are getting into loggerheads with their own parents because they behave like Westerners, because they want to have white partners, for example, because they are culturally very, very different, because they've gone to school with British people, both white and brown and black. They've gone to school with British people. They've lived in our society. They've grown up in our society. They've been taught by teachers who grew up in our society. And they share our cultural values in a way that their parents just don't, and they constantly come at loggerheads with them. I literally have a friend who just had to break up with their boyfriend because their boyfriend's parents were unhappy of the kind of life that he was living.
The Home Secretary today was talking about the effectiveness of the Rwanda scheme in deterring migrants from coming to Britain. Have I missed something? Because I didn't think the Rwanda scheme had actually started yet. And as a deterrent, frankly, if I may say so, it's a complete non-starter, isn't it?
Well, I think the truthful answer is that there hasn't been proper research on what has led to the 36% decline in illegals. The one fact that I heard the Home Secretary give us is that the weather was no worse or no better on average last year than the year before. And so it didn't seem to be weather for the year as a whole that had led to an easy win. I think there needs to be a proper study of what has deterred people. And more importantly, a study of why so many still think it's a good idea. It may well emerge that what you were saying earlier, that they think it's easy. And
I mean, this is where I sometimes have time for John Redwood. It's frustrating that I've basically seen him lying throughout this whole interview with things that I know that he knows, rather than things that he's trying to be disingenuous about to get people around to his side. But I will at least respect that he's literally being asked to do propaganda by these people, and he is saying, actually, we don't know why, we've not had any studies, can there be studies done, so I have some empirical evidence on this, which is more than you'd get for most Conservative MPs and most people who would speak to Talk TV.
And the odds are very good that it's led to so many, and we need to use that research to succeed in actually throttling back the numbers far more than the government has done today.
I mean, this is off the back of the fact that Rishi Sunak has essentially lied about clearing the asylum backlog. He literally put up a tweet earlier on today. Let me find it in my bookmarks, wherever it is. Yeah, literally, asylum backlog cleared. And he's been community noted pretty hard on this one. The backlog has not been cleared. The Prime Minister's pledge was to process 92,000 pre-June 2022 applications by the end of 2023. Around 100k cases have since entered the asylum system, which have not been processed. An additional 4,000 pre-2002 applications remain unresolved. What's also funny off the back of this as well is that on top of the fact that there are still 4,000 complex cases still going through the system from the period which he says that he's cleared the backlog from, on top of that, there is some claims that have been taken out of here as well, that 17,000 withdrawn cases where the Home Office have no idea where these people are. They've just disappeared off of the books, these withdrawn cases. So it turns out if you just lose people, probably into this modern slavery that they have no protection for anymore, if you just accidentally lose people, that you can just stop counting them as cases that you don't actually need to have cleared out the asylum backlog by just saying that they've gone missing. Again, literally like those 100 children that went missing, that we just stopped hearing about, that absolutely gigantic scandal where the Conservative government lost children into the wild. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.